Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Policy Watch. This is the 10th episode of the series, and as we get closer to Budget Day, we try and focus on the most important issues that concern the economy. The week gone by saw the government announce growth figures for the third quarter of the ongoing fiscal year. Economic growth has slipped again, making it the seventh successive financial quarter that saw a deceleration in growth. These numbers will cause the finance minister some discomfort, especially considering the core sector numbers also came out and growth in 8 key infrastructure industry is also slow. That will be our second story of the week, and we'll top it off by discussing an important report submitted to the Planning Commission that looks at trends in the employment sector during the past decade. My guest this week is Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, who is the Director General of the Institute of Applied Manpower, currently also working closely with the Planning Commission as well. Welcome to the show, Santosh. It's great having you on the show for the first time. Now, before we move into our first story, slowdown in the economy, worrying times for the Finance Minister?
Not particularly. I mean, they are worrying somewhat, there is no question about that, because of the following facts. Let's just recall the historical 10-year trend in regard to savings and investment, because it is savings rates and investment rates which drive growth rates. So let's look at the historical trends. They're as follows. Savings rates as a proportion of GDP in 2002-03 were of the order of 23%. Investment was 24% of GDP. Right. Within a matter of 6 years, by 2007-08, the savings rate had jumped up to 37% of GDP, a 14 percentage point increase, please note. And investment rate had gone from 24% to 38%.
Those were good times for the economy.
Those were good times. But I am not saying that the good times have gone away. After that, we had the economic crisis. Savings and investment both fell, and we are down to savings rate of about 32%, investment rates of this roughly the same order, which is what is showing up in the declining growth rate.
Right. We will talk about that now, just after a little while. That is our top story, like I told you before. Now, India's rate of growth slowed down to its weakest pace in almost 3 years, as the last quarter figure came down to 6.1%. Manufacturing and investments were constrained as high interest rates and rising input costs added to the slowdown. We filed a report. Take a look.
In the seventh successive slowdown in as many financial quarters, the country's rate of growth dropped to 6.1%. During the October-December period, the manufacturing sector rose at just 0.4% compared to a growth of 2.7% during the July-September period. Mining sector growth fell by 3.1%. India's farm output rose by 2.7%, while construction grew at 7.2%. Policymakers in India have been striving to weather external shocks caused by the global downturn, especially the debt crisis in Europe. Analysts believe that high interest rates hampering investments as well as manufacturing has been one of the main drivers behind the stunted growth. India has grappled with high inflation for the best part of the year, and as a result, the Reserve Bank of India has been forced to keep interest rates at a 3-year high, while other Asian countries have been cutting rates. The Reserve Bank Governor T. Subbarao is scheduled to review interest rates on March 15th. The GDP figures came just a day after the government announced that 8 core sector industries were in a slowdown mode. The double whammy is sure to weigh on Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee's mind as he struggles to contain a burgeoning fiscal deficit owing to a huge subsidy bill. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Seventh successive financial quarter that growth has slipped down. Now, industry or India Inc., as the business journalist community calls them, have had a knee-jerk reaction. I think when I was talking to you yesterday, we mentioned how Anand Mahindra tweeted that this is a warning bell, a strident alarm bell, and it could relegate us to the B team of market economies. Fair assessment?
Not particularly. I think this is simply sending a message out to the finance minister 15 days before the budget is prepared and sent out that there is a cause for worry. No question about that. But let's just remind ourselves, as well as Mr. Birla, that after all,
Anand Mahindra, actually.
Mr. Mahindra, after all, even this this last quarter, third quarter growth rate of 6.1% is not the lowest that we saw after the 2008 crisis, which was down to sort of something like 5.5. And we bounced back up from that. Please remember that we bounced back up from that, and we have I'm reasonably convinced that we've hit the bottom of the trough. We are going to bounce back up from this point onwards. Let's just remind ourselves of what the sectoral growth rates are. I know you were talking about the sectoral growth rates in the most recent period. Let's just remind ourselves of what the sectoral growth rates were over a 10-year period. For instance, between 2000 and 2005, manufacturing grew at 6%. In the latter half of the decade, from 2005 to 2010, it grew at 9.5% per annum. I'm talking about gross value added. Construction grew in the first half of the decade at 10.7% per annum and then grew at 9% per annum. Services grew at 8.5% in the first half and 10% per annum in the second half. This is up to the financial year 2010. So the point is that we are on a high growth path, and savings are going to begin to creep up, as will investment. Because household savings remain the most significant share of the total savings. The big change that has happened most recently is that the fiscal deficit has worsened and public savings have declined, because public savings there was public dis-savings when we put in a fiscal deficit, fiscal stimulus after the 2008 crisis.
But Dr. Malhotra, are you saying that despite all that, given the figures you just mentioned, all the reasons you just mentioned, the worst is over and we have only...
I'm reasonably convinced that the worst is over, and that there is an additional reason why I'm saying that the worst is over, that, there has been a sense of policy paralysis for the last year or so in particular, which has been lengthened. That policy paralysis has been partly driven by the scams, but partly driven by the fact that 5 major states were going to elections. The elections are over. Now that the elections are over and the government is in its last 2-year stretch before the next parliamentary elections, it's highly likely that the reforms will be put back in place, and the ambience, the environment for India Inc. is going to return to a more positive environment, and therefore investment is going to return. I'm reasonably confident.
So industry doesn't have to worry that much.
I don't think so.
There are people at work and factors at work that can make us bounce back. We'll talk about economic reforms, a really important point that you mentioned. We'll talk about that in a bit, but before that, let's talk about high interest rates. Now, everybody from industry to people in government, policy makers have been concerned about high interest rates. People saying that there is a school of thought that says monetary action by the RBI didn't really do what it was supposed to do with inflation, couldn't really control it. Where do you see rates going in the near future, especially given the fact that the budget is almost upon us? Do you see a rate cut in the offing? Is that what Governor Subbarao needs to do?
It needs to do it, certainly. I don't think it's the immediate action that will happen on the 15th of March. It is highly likely that it will happen by mid-April, and that will be the start of the reduction of the interest rate. Let's just remind ourselves as to why Governor Subbarao has been raising interest rates for nearly 2 years now, or maintain them at stable levels.
March 2010, the cycle started.
That's exactly right. So I'm saying, having raised them, he's maintained them at stable levels. The main reason is precisely what I was just saying a few minutes ago, which is that after the 2008 financial crisis, the government put in 4 fiscal stimuli, which took our fiscal deficit from its pre-crisis level of about 6% of GDP for center and states taken together. So it took it from that level to something like over 10% of GDP if states and center taken together.
Yeah. If you just look at the deficit, I think
the center's deficit was in the last financial year, if I remember correctly, of the order of about 5.5%. And in this financial year, it was supposed to be reduced to 4.6, but it's unlikely that it will happen. Precisely because growth has fallen, and the government is in no position to put in a fiscal stimulus again, precisely because of this. So there will be more fiscal consolidation, but fiscal consolidation has two dimensions. Let's please remind ourselves of this. One is that you're going to squeeze expenditures, especially wasteful expenditures to some extent, the subsidies. You need to phase them down, no question about that.
But are you saying
other dimension is raising taxes, and that didn't happen in the last budget, and that needs to happen in this one.
But are you saying that because the government has political compulsions, calling subsidies wasteful would be a little strong, don't you think?
You see, subsidies, when they are productive subsidies, are a good idea.
Right.
But unfortunately, our subsidies have tended to be very untargeted, which is the main reason why they have tended to be criticized as heavily as they've been.
Right.
That's the main reason. Every government in the world has subsidies. It's just that we haven't designed our subsidies very effectively, and it's the design of the subsidies which has to systematically improve, whether it is for fertilizer, for food, or for fuel.
I have one more question for you on this topic, but we'll do that after the break. We'll continue chatting with Dr. Santosh Mehrotra after the break. Don't go anywhere, stay tuned. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch. We are in conversation with Dr. Santosh Mehrotra. Dr. Mehrotra, now economic reforms have been stalled for a bit now. The so-called term policy paralysis that has been given to the government has been there for quite a while now. And you mentioned elections and, of course, how difficult it is for the government in an election year to make those unpopular, potentially unpopular decisions. Now that the elections are over, do you see the government biting the bullet on, say, subsidies or, even more important, petroleum products deregulation? Do you see that happening at all? And how important is it for the government to do that?
It's very important for the government to do that, because the fact that we have a fiscal deficit as large as it is actually reducing the liquidity for private sector to borrow. So the private sector has a double whammy. There's a liquidity crunch on the one hand, and the interest rates are high. So fiscal deficit reduction is a very important objective.
Right.
Now, how is that fiscal deficit reduction going to happen? I mean, unfortunately, most of the time, when we talk about fiscal deficit reduction, we tend to talk about expenditure squeezing. I would want to sort of just I'll come back to fiscal to expenditure squeezing, but I want to sort of remind the viewers that unfortunately we have seen in the last couple of years a decline in tax revenue to GDP ratio, which had been systematically rising over the decade up to the 2000.
I think the figure that is expected this year is 10.4% or something, the tax to GDP ratio.
Well, I haven't come across that number, but I'll be delighted if we are able to put it back onto a rising trend. It's absolutely critical. Because let's just remind ourselves that rich economies have a tax to GDP ratio of at least 40%.
Right.
And we have already become an emerging market economy. We are already a middle income country for the last 4 years. It's important that we have a tax to GDP ratio which is comparable to that of middle income countries and not of low income countries.
Right.
It's absolutely critical that we sort of generate more revenues.
Fair point.
That's a very important point, and I should tell you that that was not done in the last budget.
Fair point.
Right? The second point is that expenditure will need to be squeezed, and for that reason, fuel, fertilizer, and food subsidies have to become more efficient.
Right.
And that would mean that for instance, we already have the Nandan Nilikani committee report on the fertilizer. I think we've started a process. That process of switching from fertilizer companies being actually subsidized to farmers being subsidized, that needs to happen.
At this juncture, we'll move into our second story of the week. Now, India Inc. received some worrying news as growth in core infrastructure industries fell to a weak 0.5% as compared to 6.4% a year ago. According to the data provided by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, there was a considerable decline in 8 key infrastructure industries, which include crude oil, petroleum refinery products, natural gas, fertilizers, coal, electricity, cement, and finished steel. These figures come in just before the IIP or industrial input data for January, and that is expected to come out soon. The 8 sectors mentioned have a total weightage of 37.90% in the total industrial production numbers and is expected to weigh on the January IIP numbers scheduled to come out on March the 12th. Among the worst performers was natural gas, recording a negative growth of 8.9%. Petroleum refinery products showed a decline in production by 4.6%, while crude oil was down to 2%. Steel production declined by 2.9%. Now, the figures obviously are worrying. Core sector growth coming just before the IIP numbers. How much is it going to weigh on the IIP numbers? Is that going to affect the IIP numbers coming out on 12th of March?
We should, this is a question which will have to be analyzed actually at a sectoral level. Steel is dependent upon coal production. Now, coal production, as you know, has been suffering from multiple failures. Coal India is one of the, we are one of the biggest producers of coal in the world. We have one of the largest reserves of coal in the world. But the quality of our coal is not very good. But to top it, so we have to therefore import. And unfortunately, because of the sort of differences of opinion between the coal ministry on the one hand and the environment ministry on the other, there have been issues. On the other hand, Coal India itself has not been able to resolve a number of issues, internal issues. So those issues really have to be resolved, which is where that policy paralysis which has been plaguing the government becomes a factor. And as I was saying to you, I think the policy paralysis is going to dissipate, and Coal India really needs to get its act together. Otherwise, we're not going to get increased output of coal. So neither coal output is going to increase, nor steel output is going to increase. And coal impacts so many others. It's an input into so many others. So that I'm just using coal as an example that reforms have to happen.
Absolutely. But it's funny you mentioned coal, because coal obviously also drives the other big industry, power.
That's right.
And I was talking to some guests I think last week, and they said the same thing, saying that unless we get our coal sector right, power generation is going to go for a toss. Electricity and everything.
Very serious.
So coal is obviously very important, but to what extent are external shocks responsible for affecting our core sector growth? Say, for example, the euro debt crisis or the US economy slowing down to whatever it is right now. How far are those key factors responsible for affecting our internal growth?
You see, we have auto exports, but we have a much larger domestic market. So to the extent there are auto exports, those are impacted. But our biggest, for all these core sectors, our biggest market is in our own country. Please recall that infrastructure investment, which sort of draws upon all these core industries a lot, infrastructure investment has gone from about 4% of GDP in the beginning of the 11th five-year plan in 2007 to something like 7.5% of GDP in the last year of the 11th plan, which is this year. And it is going to go on rising from $500 billion, which we did manage to actually achieve nearly during the 11th plan period. It's going to $1 trillion. It's going to go up to 10% of GDP. So infrastructure investment is going to increase, both public as well as private. So it's going to provide the demand for all these core sectors. So I'm reasonably confident that, from this point onwards, the core sectors will actually perform better than they have done in the most recent past.
So some news that of consequence, obviously, we have something to look forward to. The other big issue that I want to talk to you about, Dr. Mehrotra, today is crude prices. Now, crude prices have been hovering around the $125 barrel mark, which is, I think, a 10-month high, global Brent crude prices. Now, how much does that affect our economy? Because it's making us go haywire. Inflation is being stoked and growth obviously stopped. What do we do about crude? I mean, not that we can do much about it, but how do we maneuver around that?
Well, one of the most important ways to maneuver around it is, of course, energy conservation. I don't think we do enough of that. You're absolutely right that there is not a lot that we can do. However, let's just look at the sort of global environment. The global environment has two sort of sort of contradictory forces in play which impact us. One is the fact that, European growth is not likely to exceed 1.5%, so there's not going to be a great demand from there.
The US economy will grow at 1.8% according to IMF.
Correct. Now, so US economy will do slightly better than the European economy, but that's not the biggest source of demand. The other big source of demand is, of course, China itself and, of course, India. These are the big sources of demand. So on the one hand, there's good news that US, on the one hand, quote unquote good news that the European economy is not growing so well. The other reason why I believe that oil prices are rising is because of the war drums being beaten around Iran and the difficulties that have arisen partly on account of Libya having sort of frozen up. So there are sources of oil where, it's these war drums are a more serious problem, which is what is driving them.
You're saying West Asia conflict will obviously affect us as well, and it has started affecting us as well. We'll take a short break right now. We'll come back and talk about the employment report that you worked so closely for. We'll be right back in no time. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're still watching Policy Watch. We'll now talk about a significant piece of work titled Creating Employment in the 12th Five-Year Plan. This comprehensive report was submitted to the Planning Commission recently. This paper discusses employment trends in the first decade of the 2000s and also addresses the problem of creating decent and productive employment in the non-agricultural sector during the first decade of the new millennium. And to discuss the observation and policy prescriptions in the paper, let's talk to the man who wrote that paper. Now, you were closely involved with other authors, obviously, in writing this. What are the employment trends that we see that you've come across?
Well, the employment trends are for the period 2005 to 2010, though we do compare them with the period 2000 to 2005. And I want to sort of share with you the fact that the situation for non-agricultural employment is actually very grim indeed, as revealed by the National Sample Survey data of 2010. You see, if you look at manufacturing, in the first half of the decade, manufacturing employment increased by 25%, from 44 million in the year 2000 to 55 million, an 11 million increase in the country as a whole. You recall, manufacturing was growing reasonably well in the first half of the decade.
Till very recently.
In the second half of the decade, I said to you earlier that manufacturing was still growing quite well. I mean, it might have not been growing as fast as it was growing earlier, but the fact of the matter is that it was growing very well. Despite that, there was an actual decline in employment in manufacturing from 55 million to 50 million. That's a 10% decline. Now, at the end of the decade in 2010, we are still sort of 6 million up from the beginning of the decade, but that's not good enough in an economy which is growing as fast as it is. We are the second fastest growing economy in the world after China. And the other point we need to recall is that China has 230 million people already in manufacturing. We have managed to decrease the number of those in manufacturing. Now let me tell you about services. Services also grew very rapidly, both in the first half and the second half of the decade. In the first half of the decade, services employment grew from 94 million to 112 million, which is about a 20% increase. In the second half of the decade, there was barely a 4% increase from 112 million to 116 million.
But what are the reasons, Dr. Mehrotra? Why are these numbers coming forward? What are the policy prescriptions? If you identified the problem, where do we go from here?
Well, I would not hesitate to say that we have the policy prescriptions just yet. As it happens, when we saw these numbers, we started a research program which is looking at doing sort of three sets of research, and in a couple of months we will have something to report to you. So we will tell you something about it. But we are playing around with some hypotheses. So I will sort of suggest to you some hypotheses which we are playing around with. which we are beginning to test. But just to remind you, it's not all bad news in regard to in regard to employment. Agricultural employment should decline in a growing economy. So agricultural employment declined not just in relative terms from 57% of all employment to 53%, but in absolute terms, it actually declined by about 15 to 20 million. The growth area was construction, which is not surprising because I was saying to you in an earlier section that infrastructure investment is growing, real estate, housing is growing. So construction employment is really booming, and we expect it to continue to boom.
Right.
But let's just go back to manufacturing, which is truly worrying. What are the hypotheses we are investigating? One is,
briefly, if you could.
Very briefly. One hypothesis we are looking at is that the wages are rising very rapidly, and there is evidence for that. Real wages have grown very rapidly, as a result of which industry there's technical change taking place. In other words, they're substituting labor for capital.
Right. So it's not all bad news is what you're saying.
No, it's not all bad news.
But we have to work harder and get
That's
our policies right. At that point, we'll have to end the program today. As Dr. Santosh Mehrotra said today, all is not bad in the economy. The industry also doesn't need to fear that much, doesn't need to cause for concern that much. He thinks that we will bounce back and it will be a better time. We've seen the worst. The worst is over as far as employment is concerned. Again, not all bad, but we need to work really hard on policy prescriptions and generating more employment. Thank you so much, Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, for joining us on Policy Watch. Till next time, when we get you another episode with another special guest, thank you and goodbye.